back to another video. This week I'm continuing with the summer sewing theme and also keep stash busting, and I'm going to be making myself a summer pair of trousers. If you're new here, hi, I'm Olga and I make sewing content that is usually vintage inspired and sometimes a little bit nerdy. So I really want to make a pair of trousers that's going to go with a lot of things, that's going to be very comfortable and wearable for every day, but also really nice and breezy and cool for summer. I have this leftover piece of black cotton fabric. I think this is cotton. It's either cotton or a very fine linen. I'm not sure because I did thrift this. And it has this really beautiful like white embroidery applique. This is like a cording that's been sewn on. The thing is though that this fabric is a little bit sheer, and also I only have 1.35 meters, and this is 1.40 meters wide. So I don't have that much fabric. I have placed the pieces on here and I know I have enough for the legs, which is the most important thing. I don't know if I have enough for like facings and pockets and all of that. So I'm planning on using this other leftover piece of black cotton sateen. I use this for my Hades jumper dress. I don't have that much of this. I think maybe just over 1 meter, I think, but I'm going to use this for the lining and also for any kind of like piecing that I might want to do for facings and that kind of thing. I'm not going to be doing a full lining because obviously I wouldn't have enough fabric for that. For the pattern, I'm going to be making another pair of Nasrin pants from Mood Fabrics. I really enjoyed making these and wearing them all winter. I made a cotton flannel pair last winter. I think I might want to taper the leg a little bit more as well because I think that would look better. Yeah, that's everything for now. So I'm gonna go get started with piecing and cutting and kind of like mapping out what I want to do with these fabrics. And yeah, let's go and do that. I started by pinning the trouser leg pieces to the main fabric. I moved them around a little bit to see how I could get the most out of the fabric, and then I settled on this layout here. Like I mentioned in the intro, I don't have quite enough fabric for every single piece of this pattern. I only had enough for the outer waistband, so the facing will be made up from the lining fabric. And I have to piece the pocket because this slash pocket is all in one, and I don't have a big enough section to place it on, so I'll just piece it from both fabrics. For slash pockets, you have a visible part at the hip and the rest is hidden, so it's important to remember to cut out the visible section from the main fabric. I learned that the hard way, trust me. When doing this, you can fold or cut the pattern pieces to accommodate the space you do have, but always remember to add seam allowance to the folded or cut lines on both sides so that you can put them back together and actually form the original piece. Once I was happy with the placement of all the pattern pieces, I cut them out, transferred the markings, and then moved on to the lining fabric. The lining I am using is a cotton sateen, and I don't have very much, but it is a really wide fabric, so I am confident it'll be enough for my plans. From the lining, I need the waistband facings, the other half of the pocket, and the legs. Now obviously I don't have enough for the full leg, but I am going to do a partial lining where it's just lined to the knee or thereabouts. I then cut out all the lining pieces and started transferring my markings again. The only markings I need here are the front pleat and the back darts. I also started pinning the pocket sections together to form the full pocket piece. To do this, you just pin one side to the other with right sides together along the new line you added. And then I started pinning my darts flat like I always do. And then I got a brainwave. If you can turn a dart into a pleat, surely you can turn a pleat into a dart, right? That's exactly what I decided to do for my front pleats. I essentially winged it. I used the pleat and extended it into a dart. Then I measured how long the dart was from the raw edge to the tip, and I replicated that on the other front pieces so that they would all be the same. The reason I decided to do this was because I always felt like my other pair of these trousers seems to have a lot of fabric around the tummy, and although I know that's like a style, I always felt like it wasn't the most flattering on me, or I guess I didn't really like the way it looked on me. So I thought I would give this a try because in theory it would solve that issue. Spoiler alert, it definitely did solve that issue. I stitched the pocket pieces together, trimmed the seam allowance, and finished the edge with a zigzag stitch before pressing them. The waistband is made up of 4 equal pieces, 2 for the outside and 2 for the facings. So I went ahead and stitched them up at the side seam, the main fabric to the main fabric, and the facing to the facing, if that makes sense. Then it was time to sew all of those darts. I start at the wide end of the dart, backstitch, and then I follow the lines to the tip where I do not backstitch, but leave the thread tails long to tie them off later. It's hard to show you on black fabric what I'm doing, but when it's time to press the darts, I press them to one side, usually the back, and then I tie off the long threads at the tip of the dart a few times, like 3 or 4 times, and then I cut them off, leaving about an inch or a couple of centimeters behind. And I do that 8 times for all 8 of my darts. Next, I press the seam allowances of the waistbands open, and while I'm here, I also pressed up the seam allowance of the bottom of the waistband facing, which will make life easier later. Just a little FYI, Mood patterns usually call for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is like 1.27 centimeters. I googled that. Whereas most commercial patterns call for a 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters. The pattern will always specify, so make sure you double check if you're unsure. To sew the slash pockets, I started by pinning each pocket to its respective trouser front piece with right sides together along that diagonal line. Then I stitched that down, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish. I trimmed the seam allowances, and normally I would have added a zigzag stitch here to finish that seam, but since this section is getting lined, I kind of skipped it and moved straight on to pressing. When pressing, I like to press the seam allowances and the pocket away from the front pieces first, and then fold the pocket back to the inside and press it again. I also went ahead and pressed the pocket in half here. Then I top stitched that seam to keep the pocket in place and make sure that the line remains nice and crisp. But if you want an invisible finish here, I would recommend that you understitch this seam. And obviously my bobbin ran out at this point, so I'm just gonna go fix that real quick. Next, I pinned the pocket close along the bottom and the side up to the slash, stitched that in place and trimmed the seam allowances. Now it's time for another alteration. I am chopping off the fly extension off the front pieces. I drew the line I wanted on one piece and then used that as a pattern for the others. Just like I did for my last pair, I'm changing the front closure to a side closure, which is much more retro. Then I pinned the 2 front lining pieces to each other with right sides together along the crotch seam. I'm doing the same for the back lining pieces, and then of course repeat that for the main pair. Most patterns will tell you to do the main pair and then repeat those steps for the lining, or even if it's addressed, that's how they tell you to do things. But I think it's more efficient to do them at the same time, so that's usually what I do. Anyway, I went ahead and stitched all of those seams, making sure to backstitch at the start and finish as always. I then trimmed the seam allowances, and again, this is where you would serge or zigzag those raw edges, but for lined garments, you don't really need to. So I moved straight on to pressing them. You can press the seam allowances open or to one side, whatever you prefer. I'm using my tailor's ham here to help me with the rounded seams. The one I use, as well as most of the materials and tools I used in this video, are going to be linked in the description. If you're wondering about a fabric or a tool from one of my videos, it's most likely linked in the description, so make sure you check it out. Just like in my last video where I made the vintage playset, here you have to decide which side you want your zipper. I like to have mine on the left, so I mark that on the fabric and start pinning the front and back pieces together at the opposite side seam with right sides together. I also pinned the inseam, which is the one on the inside of the trousers or the shorts. I always start by matching the front and back crotch seams here, and then I pin down from there. After I have the lining pinned, I repeat that for the main pair as well. Then I stitched those seams on my machine. I trimmed the seam allowances and finished the raw edges of the main pair with the zigzag stitch on my machine. If I was doing a full lining, I would skip this, but because I need the bottom section of the trousers to be finished, I just went ahead and did the whole thing. I also finished the raw edges of the side where I'll be inserting the zipper, but here I just zigzagged them separately. Then I pressed the seams on both the lining and the main pair. I used my seam roll here because it does make this process way easier. Next, I stitched my zipper in. I use a zipper foot and I press the teeth of the zipper away from the tape to make this process a lot easier. Then I close the zipper, mark where it needs to go on the other side so that any seams or raw edges or whatever match up, and then I stitch that side as well. I went ahead and closed the rest of that side seam, making sure that the stitching line matches up to the zipper to avoid any bumps and lumps in that area. Using my seam roll, I press the seam allowances of the side seam open, and then I also press around the area of the zipper. I trimmed the zipper down and heat sealed the ends with my little lighter. Next, I measured the distance between the waistband and the end of the zipper so I know how much I need to leave open on the lining. I added a couple centimeters to that measurement and then marked it on the lining. Now I could close the remainder of that side seam. When pressing, I pressed the seam allowances open on the stitched portion, and on the gap left open, I pressed the seam allowances in on both sides so that I can stitch them to the zipper more easily. Because I'm doing a partial lining, I am going to go ahead and hem the lining now. If you're doing a full lining, you could do it now, or you could do it at the end with the main pair, it doesn't really matter. For this hem, I folded up the raw edge 1 centimeter, or 3/8 of an inch, I think. And then I folded that up again the same amount and pinned it in place. Actually, I clipped it in place in this case, but you get what I mean. Then I went ahead and top stitched that on the machine and pressed it in place. Now it's time to stuff the trousers into the lining with wrong sides together. There's lots of different ways to do this, I'm sure, but this is the way I went with today. I pinned the 2 layers together along the waistband, making sure to match the side seams and all of the darts. Oh, we have a thunderstorm going on. Okay. If you can hear the thunder, I'm sorry. Okay. Then I pinned the outer waistband to this with right side facing the right side of the main pair of the trousers. The waistband is going to be too long for your trousers if you're also not doing the front fly closure. I'm going to use this extra fabric to add a button or snap or something of that nature. However, you could also just chop it off and have the zipper come all the way up to the waistband if you wanted, but then you'd have to add the outer waistband before adding the zipper and the lining. So I sew the waistband to the trousers on the machine, making sure to move the fabric if needed to avoid any tucks or any mistakes. Next, I trimmed the seam allowance, added my tag to the waistband facing, and then pressed the seam allowances of the waistband up. Then I pinned the facing to the waistband with right sides together, including around the short edges at the ends and also matching the side seams. I stitched that in place on the machine. I used my seam gauge to help me know where I'll need to pivot on corners to make things a little bit easier and more accurate. I trimmed the seam allowances and clipped the corners to reduce the bulk of the waistband, and yes, I did forget to interface the waistband, but you probably should not forget to interface yours. Now I could flip the facing to the inside and press the waistband in place. If you wanted, you could top stitch the waistband, but I decided against it. So I pinned the folded edge of the facing in place, the place being just over the stitching line, the outer waistband to the trousers, and then I started slip stitching it by hand. And then I repeated that for the folded edge of the lining around the zipper, making sure that I'm not getting too close to the zipper teeth so that when I use it, the zipper doesn't get stuck in the stitches. Again, learned that one the hard way. Before I move on to the hem of the trousers, I just want to tack the hem of the lining to all of the side seams of the trousers to keep that in place. I just do a few whip stitches in the seam allowances to keep it all invisible but secure. Speaking of invisible finishes, it's time to hem the trousers and do it invisibly but very easily. I tried on the trousers and figured out where I wanted the hem and marked that with a clip. Then I measured that, marked a straight line on the trousers and a second line 2 centimeters below that. That's because my hemming web is 2 centimeters wide. I cut the excess along the lower line and used that as a pattern to cut off the excess in the opposite leg. I made these a little bit more cropped to make them, more summery. Next, I finished the raw edges of the hems on both legs with a zigzag stitch on my machine. To apply the hemming web, I first pressed the seam allowance in all around the leg. I cut the amount of hemming web that I needed. I inserted it into the little hem that I had previously pressed, and using my seam roll, I pressed over the seam to fuse the web to both sides at once. There are different kinds of hemming products. This one fuses both layers at once, but some do give you the option of fusing one side at a time. Last but not least, I added a hook and bar closure to the waistband over the zipper, and I was ready for the reveal. I love how these turned out. The fit is absolutely perfect. The front darts were such a great idea. They're comfortable and exactly what I had pictured, so I am really happy with them. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel and maybe follow me on Instagram or TikTok. But for now, thanks so much for watching and happy sewing.